I held on to my grandmother's old hand-knitted scarf, rubbing the soft yarn between my fingers as if that would somehow bring her back. The funeral home smelled like artificial flowers mixed with polish from the wooden furniture, and I sat tucked away in a corner, trying to stay out of sight. My mom, Patricia, dabbed her eyes with a fancy handkerchief, letting out these loud, dramatic sobs every few minutes. They bounced off the dark wooden walls like an echo. Every time she came back from the bathroom, she had fresh mascara on, her lipstick perfect, her phone in her hand like it was part of her. I watched her click her camera and pose by the casket, making sure to get the right angle for her social media followers. Ugh. This lighting is awful, she muttered under her breath after checking her pictures. My dad, Richard, stood near the front doors. His voice was raised as he argued with the funeral director about the cost of everything. These fees are outrageous, he snapped, while still tapping on his phone screen, clearly watching his stock alerts. To him, this funeral was just an inconvenience, something getting in the way of his investments. My older brother, Brian, slouched in a chair with his head bent over his phone, the blue glow from his cryptocurrency app reflected in his glasses. And I realized he hadn't looked up for at least 20 minutes. Even when distant relatives came over to say they were sorry for our loss, he barely moved. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, and thought back to weekends at Grandma, Nora, and Grandpa Henry's house. I could still smell the cinnamon rolls baking on Sunday mornings. I could picture Grandpa teaching me how to change the oil in his old delivery truck. His hands were rough, but steady as they guided mine. Ellie, remember, he always told me, understanding how things work is more valuable than always buying new things. A tear slipped down my cheek. A real tear, not the fake ones my mom was showing off. Later that afternoon, we gathered in the office of the family lawyer, Daniel Ford. The room had dark wood walls and shelves packed with old law books. The faint smell of pipe tobacco still hung in the air. Mom immediately sat in the center chair, like she was the star of a portrait. Dad stood right behind her, resting his hands on the chair as if he was in charge of the whole room. I was thinking we could sell the lake house right away, Mom said casually, inspecting her nails. The market's hot, and that property has such a beautiful view. The boat should sell fast, too, Dad added with a nod. And the antiques, Mom continued, already listing things in her head. Brian finally looked up from his phone and cut in. Don't get ahead of yourselves. I've already got buyers interested in Grandpa's truck fleet. I could use that money for my startup. Before they could go further, Daniel cleared his throat. The sound was sharp and silenced everyone. His eyes flicked toward me for a moment, and something in his expression was hard to read. Then he placed a thick folder on his desk, his movements slow and deliberate. As the executor of Henry and Nora White's estate, he began, his voice calm but firm. I am required to read their final wishes exactly as written. The room leaned forward in unison. Mom adjusted her posture like she was posing again. Dad looked ready to argue, and Brian slid his phone into his pocket, for the first time all day. Daniel pushed his glasses up and began reading the document, line by line. It was filled with legal language that didn't mean much to me, until he reached one particular sentence. He paused, breathed in deeply, and spoke the words that changed everything. I hereby leave my entire estate, valued at approximately $31.5 million, to my granddaughter, Eleanor Grace White. The room froze. It felt like the air had been sucked out. My ears rang. I blinked hard, certain I had heard it wrong. The entire estate, my dad repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. This has to be some kind of mistake. Mom blurted, her practiced social media smile vanishing instantly. Brian stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. What did you do? He snapped, his eyes burning into mine. How did you trick them? His accusation cut deeper than any slap. My throat tightened. I didn't, I said, my voice shaking. I swear, I had no idea. Daniel raised his hand to quiet everyone. Henry and Nora expected this kind of reaction, he explained. They left behind something for all of you. He turned his computer screen toward us and pressed play on the screen. My grandparents appeared sitting together on their porch swing. They looked older and tired, but their eyes still had that spark I remembered. If you're seeing this, Grandpa began, then our decision must have been a shock. Grandma's voice followed, soft but steady. Richard, Patricia, Brian. We've heard the way you speak about us when you thought we weren't listening. We've seen how you've planned for our money while we were still alive. My chest tightened. Memories of all the weekends I spent with them flashed before me. While my parents went to parties and networking events, I was at their little home, a home I now realized hid a fortune. I helped Grandpa fix his small fleet of trucks, the ones that turned into a shipping business. Grandma taught me how to bake, how to garden, how to live with meaning instead of pretending. Eleanor is the only one who ever loved us for who we are, Grandma said, her eyes shining with tears. Not for what we could give her. The video ended, and Daniel closed his laptop with finality. The silence was deafening when we stepped outside later. Dad cornered me against my car. His breath was hot on my face as he leaned in close. You'll sign everything over to me tomorrow, he ordered in a low voice. You can keep 12%. That's fair. Mom appeared beside him, her hand gently brushing his arm. Her voice was fake sweet, darling. Listen, this kind of money requires experience to handle. You're not ready. Let us take care of it for you. Brian loomed behind them, his jaw tight. Think about family loyalty, Ellie. Remember who always took care of you. My hands shook as I gripped my car keys, the metal digging into my palm. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to speak. I need time to think. Dad's face turned cold, his words sharp. Remember who owns the building you live in. One phone call from me, and you're on the street. They walked away together, united in greed. I stood frozen by my car, the keys biting into my skin, the weight of $31 million pressing down on me like a crushing stone. That night in my tiny apartment, panic filled my chest. Everything I owned could fit into that one room. My job as a school counselor barely covered rent. I had no savings, no backup plan. I sank onto my bed, clutching Grandma's scarf like it was a lifeline. Then came a pounding on my door. Building inspection, a gruff voice called out. At the same time, my phone buzzed. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. Ellie, he said urgently, they're planning to lock you out of your apartment. It's not legal, but they might still try. You need to get out right now. Tears blurred my vision as I grabbed a backpack and shoved essentials inside. My hands shook so badly I could hardly zip it. I never imagined that inheriting a fortune would make me feel more unsafe than I ever had before. But as I wrapped Grandma's scarf around my neck, I could almost hear her voice in my head. Stand your ground, Ellie girl. Some things are worth fighting for. The next day, rain poured as I drove to my grandparents' lake house. The craftsman style home sat quietly at the water's edge, built from cedar and stone. It wasn't flashy like the mansions nearby, but it had always been full of warmth. I sat in the car for a long moment, watching raindrops race down the glass, my heart pounding. Just yesterday, I was fleeing my apartment with nothing but a backpack. Now, I was about to walk into a house worth millions, a house that somehow belonged to me. The front door opened before I even reached it. Miguel Sanchez, the estate manager who had worked for my grandparents for 15 years, stood in the entryway. His face was lined, his voice thick with emotion. Miss Ellie, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Welcome home, I stepped. Inside, dripping water onto the oak floors. The air smelled like lemon oil and cinnamon, just as it always had. Miguel handed me a small brass key. Your grandmother asked me to give you this. If things ever came to this point, he led me into Grandpa's study, where a heavy antique desk stood proudly. The key fit into a drawer. revealing a worn leather journal tied with a faded ribbon. "She said you would understand when the time came," Miguel said softly, squeezing my shoulder before leaving me alone. I curled up in Grandpa's big reading chair, the fire crackling nearby, and untied the ribbon. The first entry was dated 10 years ago. "Richard came today asking for another loan," it read. "He swears his investment will triple in months." When Henry hesitated, he reminded us of how expensive Brian's college tuition is. We wrote the check. "Henry says we won't see that money again." My stomach twisted as I flipped forward. Another entry: "Richard hasn't paid us back." When I asked about it, he acted like I had imagined the whole thing. "Henry says to let it go. It's only money," he says. "But it's the pattern that worries me." Page after page revealed the truth. My parents had been draining them for years, using charm, pressure, and lies. I turned another page with trembling hands. As I kept flipping through the pages of Grandma's journal, the truth started hitting me harder than I expected. There was another entry written a few months later. "Patricia came with some designers today. She claimed they were helping her update the house. They measured rooms, took photos, and whispered about changes. Later, I found her photographing my silver set, the one from Henry's mother. When I asked her why, she said it was for inspiration for her anniversary party decorations." I sat there, stunned. My mom hadn't just been greedy. She had been quietly preparing to take things even before my grandparents were gone. Just then, the study door creaked open, and June, the longtime housekeeper who had worked for my grandparents for over 20 years, walked in carrying a tray of tea. Her eyes were swollen and red, like she'd been crying. "You're reading Mrs. Nora's journals," she said gently. It wasn't even a question. "Did you know about all of this?" I asked, pointing at the open pages. June set the tray down and nodded. "I kept my own records too. Mrs. Nora asked me to." She left the room for a moment and returned with a large banker's box. She placed it on the desk with a heavy thud. Inside were financial documents, loan agreements my father had never repaid, startup proposals for my brother that had all failed, and even copies of property transfer documents my mother had tried to get my grandmother to sign only a few months before she passed. June handed me the thickest folder of them all. "These are the copies of what your mother tried to pull off," she explained. She said they were just updated estate plans, recommended by their financial advisor. But in reality, they would have transferred key properties into her name quietly. I spread the papers across the desk, my eyes scanning through them in disbelief. Thousands of dollars funneled into my dad's failed projects. Startup after startup of my brothers that had eaten up money like a black hole. My mom's sneaky attempts to change ownership behind their backs. They were bleeding them dry, I whispered. "For years," June replied softly. "Your grandfather always tried to believe the best of your father. But your grandmother, she saw more clearly." I kept turning the journal pages. One entry from a Christmas 2 years ago nearly broke me. Brian had too much wine at dinner. He thought we had gone to bed, but I overheard him telling Richard, "When the old folks die, we'll be set for life." Richard laughed. Our grandson laughed about our deaths. I remembered that Christmas. I had worked double shifts just to afford the train ticket home. My mom had complained about the sweater I wore, saying it looked cheap, while Brian had proudly shown off his new designer watch. Now I realized what had been happening behind the scenes. The doorbell rang, pulling me back to the present. June glanced at her watch and nodded. "That'll be Mr. Shaw and Ms. Park." Moments later, Marcus Shaw walked in. He had been my grandparents' financial advisor for nearly 20 years. He carried a leather folder, and his normally calm face looked tense. "Eleanor," he said, shaking my hand, "I've brought the complete portfolio. You need to understand exactly what you're protecting." Right behind him came Evelyn Park, Grandpa's old business partner at Summit Freight. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried a thick stack of company records. Summit employees have been reporting some strange visitors, she said immediately. People asking questions about shipping routes, client contracts. Someone is fishing for weaknesses. Not long after, Daniel, the lawyer, arrived carrying legal folders under his arm. I've already prepared protective measures, he told me. But we need to act quickly. We all gathered around the dining room table. It struck me suddenly, these people weren't just professionals. They were forming a circle of protection around me, around my grandparents' legacy. As they spread documents across the table, I started to see the full picture. Grandpa and Grandma had built an empire, and my family had been working for years to slowly tear it apart. My phone buzzed, and when I played the voicemail, my father's voice filled the room. You have no idea what you're up against, Ellie, he said coldly. This can end with everyone happy, or it can get very ugly. Your choice. Before I could even respond, the doorbell rang again. This time it was a courier, holding a manila envelope with no return address. Inside were childhood photos of me, each with my face crossed out in red marker. This is escalating fast, Daniel muttered, putting the photos into a bag for evidence. Evelyn frowned. Employees at Summit are nervous. Some think the company might not survive this mess. My brother has started posting about me online, I said, my hands shaking as I set down the envelope, claiming I'm unstable. And your mother has already called your workplace, June added, saying she's worried about your mental state. I buried my face in my hands. What do? We file for emergency protective orders, Daniel said, already pulling out prepared documents. The evidence is overwhelming. Judge Carter will approve them right away. There's something else you need to know, June said quietly. Mrs. Nora set aside the small cottage in Port Orchard. It's in a separate trust. She wanted you to have a safe place if things ever got bad. I thought about my job at the school, about the kids who counted on me every day. I realized I'd probably have to take a leave of absence. My chest felt heavy, like the weight of all of this was finally sinking in. I stepped out into the garden, the rain dripping from the roses Grandma had planted years ago. They would bloom again soon, but she wouldn't be here to see them. I never wanted their money. I whispered into the wet soil. I just wanted them. But as I turned back toward the house and the group of people waiting inside, people ready to stand with me, I realized my grandparents had left me more than just money. They had left me allies, truth, and a responsibility to fight for what was right. 3 days later, I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee in front of me, staring at the morning newspaper. The headlines screamed back at me. Family contests suspicious inheritance. My hand trembled as I read. The article quoted unnamed family sources claiming Grandma had been mentally unstable in her final months, unfit to make decisions. They're really doing this, I whispered. Almost immediately, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Richard filed an emergency petition. Claims Nora was mentally incompetent when signing the will. Call me. Before I could dial, a notification popped up on my screen. It was a screenshot of my mom, Patricia, smiling sadly on a local morning show, pretending to cry as she talked about elder abuse and being heartbroken. The walls of my grandparents' house felt like they were closing in on me. I forced myself to breathe deeply, the same way I always told my students to when anxiety hit them hard. Miguel knocked on the door and walked in holding a tablet. Miss Ellie, you should see this. On the screen was a social media page my brother had made overnight, Justice for the White Family Legacy. It already had hundreds of followers, with people commenting about their concerns for me. Miguel added, 3 clients from Summit have received anonymous letters questioning the company's stability. His face was grave. They're attacking from every side, I said quietly. My own voice sounded unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. Your grandfather knew this might happen, Miguel said gently. He motioned toward the study. It may be time you read his business journals. Back in the study, I opened an old leather-bound book, from 1987. The year Summit Freight almost collapsed during a recession. My grandfather's handwriting filled the pages. The bank rejected another loan today. One entry read, Nora. Thinks we should sell the house, but I can't risk losing our home. Tomorrow, I'll speak with the drivers. We'll work out a temporary pay arrangement. When everyone says you'll fail, that's when you need to find your backbone. I traced the lines with my fingers, feeling the indentations his pen had left decades ago. Tears blurred my vision, but there was a strength in those words. There's more, Miguel said softly. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small USB drive. Mrs. Nora installed security cameras last year. She never told your parents. On the computer, I clicked play. Footage from the day of the funeral filled the screen. There was my dad and Brian, moving through rooms with their phones out, checking values, and quietly wrapping small items into their coats. My mom was carefully photographing silver and antiques, wiping her fake tears in between. They were stealing, I whispered, my heart breaking. They were pretending to grieve while stealing. Miguel nodded. Mrs. Nora knew. She documented everything. The security system beeped suddenly, breaking the silence. Miguel checked his phone, his eyes narrowing. They're here, he said. All of them. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved to the window. Outside the iron gates, 3 vehicles idled: Dad's Mercedes, Mom's Range Rover, Brian's Tesla. Should I call Daniel? Miguel asked. I swallowed hard, hearing Grandpa's words echo in my head. Find your backbone. No, I said firmly. I'll handle this. The intercom crackled with my dad's voice. Eleanor, open the gates. We're here to collect family heirlooms that belong to all of us. I pressed the button and answered. I'll meet you on the front steps. The summer sun beat down as I stepped outside, standing alone on the wide stone steps. The gates opened, and I braced myself for what was coming. The gates creaked open, and my family walked toward me like they owned the place. Dad came first, holding a leather briefcase in one hand. His face looked calm, but his eyes gave him away cold, calculating. Mom followed right behind him in a sleek black dress, her phone in her hand, ready to capture every angle. Brian lagged just a step behind, his shoulders tense, his phone already out of his pocket. This has gone on long enough, Dad announced, his voice booming like he was standing at a boardroom table instead of on my grandparents' front lawn. We're here to collect what belongs to the family, starting with great-grandmother's silver service and the Tiffany lamps. I stood, my ground on the steps. Those items were specifically listed in the will as mine, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. We're contesting that will, Mom cut in, her fake sympathy dripping from every word. Sweetheart, you're in way over your head. Let us manage things until the courts make a final decision. Brian suddenly moved forward, trying to push past me up the steps. I'll just grab my stuff from my old room, he muttered, but... Then, right on cue, a low humming sound started, and small red lights blinked around the property. The new security system Daniel had installed was live. I folded my arms. Trespassing prevention measures. The cameras are streaming directly to a secure server. Every move you make here will be recorded. Mom gasped dramatically, clutching her chest. Then, slowly, she let herself collapse onto the lawn. My own daughter, she wailed, treating us like criminals. The crunch of gravel made me turn. Miguel walked up from the side of the house, holding a leather binder in his hands. Miss Ellie, here's the full inventory of the house, and documentation you requested. Behind him, June appeared, her gray hair pinned back neatly. I witnessed them taking items after the funeral, she said firmly, her voice carrying. I've already given a sworn statement to Mr. Ford. Then a silver sedan pulled up behind my parents' cars. Out stepped Evelyn Park, Grandpa's longtime business partner, followed by 5 Summit Freight employees in their company polos. We came to show our support, she said clearly. Walter and Nora built this company on integrity. We stand by their wishes. Mom, who was still on the grass, sat up straighter. Her dramatic faint had completely disappeared. Now that she saw the audience forming, another car pulled in. Daniel's BMW. He got out, holding a leather folder. Perfect timing, he said, walking toward us. I was about to update Eleanor on the restraining order. But since you're all here, I can serve the papers directly. Dad's face turned red. He opened his mouth to argue, but from the street came more voices. Neighbors were gathering, phones out, watching everything. Mrs. Henderson from across the street raised her phone. We called the media, she shouted. Neighborhood Watch looks out for our own. Sure enough, a news van slowed at the gate. Its logo clear as day. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in my father's eyes. He glanced at the cameras, the papers Daniel held, the crowd gathering. He muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." But I could see he was already retreating. Mom stood up quickly, dusting off her dress. Her fake faint was forgotten as she hurried after Dad. Brian hesitated. For the first time in a long while, his eyes actually met mine. There was something in his look, regret, maybe, or shame. But then Dad barked his name, and he followed them without another word. That night, I stood in my grandparents' bedroom, the room they had shared for more than 50 years. Everything was just as they had left it. Grandma's knitting basket sat beside her chair, needles still poking out of a half-finished scarf. Grandpa's glasses were neatly folded on the nightstand next to his favorite mystery novel. The grief I had been holding back all week finally hit me like a wave. I sat on the edge of their bed, clutching one of Grandma's knitting needles, tears streaming down my face. I don't know if I can be who they believed I could be, I whispered into the empty room. By dawn, I was still sitting there, staring at the light filtering through the lace curtains Grandma had sewn herself. The grief hadn't gone, but something else had taken its place. Resolved. Later that morning, I met with the team in Grandpa's study. Daniel came with legal folders, Marcus with financial reports, Evelyn with updates from Summit Freight. For the first time, I took Grandpa's seat at the head of the table. We need more than just defense, I told them. We need a plan. To build something sustainable, Daniel nodded. I've already prepared injunctions to stop further harassment. I've locked down the accounts and investments with extra protections, Marcus added. Summit's employees are behind you, Evelyn reported. Morale improved once they saw your commitment to jobs and stability. I heard my grandfather's voice in my head as I spoke. We're not just defending, we're building. Just then, June entered carrying a dusty cardboard box. Found this in the attic, she said. Thought you should see it. The label, written in Grandma's careful handwriting. Read, in case of Richard. Inside were decades worth of organized papers, letters, recordings, financial documents, all cataloged neatly. At the very bottom was a small leather book. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. Is this what I think it is? I whispered. June nodded. Mrs. Nora said you'd recognize it when the time came. It was Grandpa's original business ledger, from 1962, the year he founded Summit Freight. The document included the legal framework that made it nearly impossible to challenge the will. We ended that meeting with something I hadn't felt since the funeral, hope. A week later, I sat at Grandpa's antique oak desk, running my hands over the worn edges. The leather chair still held the shape of his body from decades of use. I picked up the phone, steadying my breath. Mr. Delgado, yes, this is Eleanor White. I'd like to discuss expanding the profit-sharing program for Summit's drivers. The morning passed in a blur of calls and meetings. Drivers, mechanics, office staff, they all came into the study one by one. When I told them about new profit-sharing and increased benefits, their eyes lit up. Some even clapped. This is what Walter would have wanted, Evelyn said, smiling as she handed out packets. Later, I spoke on the phone with Dr. Reynolds about starting vocational scholarships. My grandfather always believed in skilled trades, I told him. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Your father contacted 3 major clients directly. He's claiming family instability. Minutes later, the operations manager called to report something worse. My mom had shown up at my school, cornering the principal, claiming I was mentally unfit to work. She didn't get far, the principal told me. If anything, she came off as unstable herself. Then Miguel came into the study holding a sealed envelope. This was delivered by courier. Inside was a thick folder labeled Evidence of Manipulation. It included photos of me with my grandparents' email printouts, even fake psychological evaluations. But when I got to the last page, I let out a sharp laugh. They included their own emails, I said, passing the page to Daniel. Threatening Grandma last year when she refused to sign over property. They're desperate, Daniel agreed. And desperation makes them sloppy. The next morning was the Chamber of Commerce luncheon. According to Evelyn, Dad had been planning a public confrontation there for weeks. Ready? She asked as we pulled into the parking lot. I nodded. Let's do this. The banquet room was full of business leaders. As soon as I walked in, I felt dozens of eyes on me. Dad spotted me across the room, and his jaw tightened. He walked over quickly, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. There she is, the girl destroying our family's legacy, he said sharply. Walter would be ashamed of what you've done. Before I could answer, Chamber President Jack Wilson stood up, tapping his glass. Actually, Richard, we're here today to recognize Summit Freight for 40 years of integrity and community service. The room erupted in applause as Jack handed me a crystal award. I swallowed the lump in my throat and took the microphone. My grandparents built Summit Freight on 2 foundations, I said, my voice steady. Excellence in service and investment in people. Their legacy isn't about money. It's about lives changed for the better. The applause turned into a standing ovation. Former employees stood to share stories of how Grandpa had helped them during hard times. Local charities praised Grandma's quiet generosity. The community college announced the new scholarship program funded by the Monroe Foundation. For the first time, I saw the tide turning. Later that evening, the news showed clips of my father's red face and my mother's frozen smile at the luncheon. Reporters shared Daniel's press release and June's statements about my parents' behavior toward my grandparents. The ripple effect spread quickly. Dad's business partners began pulling away. Mom's social group left her out of fundraising events. Brian's startup investors backed out after learning about his history of failed ventures. Even the country club suspended their membership. Through it all, I refused every interview request. We focus on building, not tearing down, I told Miguel when he handed me another request from a morning show. But cracks were starting to show in their united front. 3 nights later, my phone rang close to midnight. I didn't even need to check the caller ID. I knew that ringtone. It was Mom. Ellie, she sobbed into the phone, her voice thick with what sounded like real tears. This isn't what I wanted. You have to believe me. I stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch between us. Your father, she started, then stopped. I never meant for things to go this far. The call ended with her still crying, but something about it felt different. The next morning, a text popped up on my phone from Brian. Dad's losing it. I didn't know about the loans he took in my name. Can we talk? Just us. The following day, Daniel told me that Dad's attorney had reached out, asking for a meeting without Richard present. They're cracking, Daniel said. The United Front is gone. That night, I sat on the porch swing where my grandparents had spent so many evenings. My journal lay open on my lap, but my pen hovered above the blank page. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the creak of the swing, feeling the cool night air. Finally, I started writing. Victory feels hollow when it's family, but surrendering what they entrusted to me would be worse. Sometimes standing Your ground doesn't feel like winning. It just feels necessary. A week later, I called for a final confrontation. We gathered at the lake house. I set Grandpa's old pocket watch on the polished table in front of me, its steady ticking a reminder that time was moving forward. Whether we were ready or not, at exactly 10 o'clock, car doors slammed outside. "Ready?" Daniel asked, straightening his tie. I smoothed Grandma's scarf between my fingers and nodded, as ready as I'll ever be. Miguel opened the front door, his face carefully neutral. My parents and brother entered like they still owned the place. Dad strode in first, but his confidence faltered when he saw Judge Carter seated at the table. Mom's camaraderie smile froze when she noticed Daniel Brooks, the retired police chief and Grandpa's old fishing buddy, standing near the window. "What is this?" Dad demanded. "We agreed to a family meeting, not a public trial." "We agreed to mediation," I corrected. "These are the mediators I selected." Brian came in last, tugging nervously at his collar. His eyes darted between me and our parents, shame flickering across his face. Mom tried to glide toward me with open arms. "Darling, let's talk privately. Family matters should stay inside the family." "Family matters should involve real family," I interrupted. "Please, sit down." Dad's face darkened. "I refuse to participate in this circus. Either clear the room, or we leave." "We proceed with transparency," I said firmly. "Or not at all. Your choice." After a tense moment, they sat. Daniel opened his folder, Exhibit A. The TV screen lit up with security footage from the night after the funeral. It showed Dad and Brian loading paintings into Dad's SUV. Mom wrapped silver candlesticks in her scarf before slipping them into her purse. Dad's voice was dismissive, but it cracked a little. We were safeguarding family heirlooms. Daniel clicked again. Exhibit B. Financial records filled the screen. Over $4 million in unpaid loans from my grandparents to my father. Exhibit C. Mom's attempt to transfer property deeds while Grandma was hospitalized. Brian's failed startups funded by family money. Phone recordings of my parents discussing how to divide assets before Grandpa had even passed. With every slide, the room grew heavier. Mom's mascara ran as her tears smeared her cheeks. Dad's knuckles turned white around the folder. Brian hunched lower and lower in his chair. Finally, Daniel opened Grandma's leather journal. "In Nora White's own words," he said. Dated last June, he read, "Richard demanded another $100,000 today." When I reminded him about the unpaid loans, he threatened that we wouldn't want Brian to learn about certain family matters. I recognized it as a threat. Henry and I have decided Eleanor is our only hope of preserving what we've built. The silence that followed was unbearable. "You manipulated them," Dad spat finally, his voice trembling with fury. "You turned them against us." "No," I said calmly, surprising myself with how steady my voice was. "Your actions turned them against you." I slid a document across the table. "This is my offer, a small trust for each of you, but only if you return everything you took and agree to stop contacting me or anyone tied to Summit Freight or the Foundation." Dad laughed bitterly. "Or what?" "Or I press charges," I said flatly. "For theft, elder abuse, and fraud. Every piece of evidence is documented, witnessed by a judge and a former chief of police. You've turned everyone against us," Dad roared, slamming his fist on the table. "No, Dad," I said, meeting his eyes. "You did that all by yourself." For 10 long minutes, the room was silent except for the ticking of Grandpa's watch. Finally, Dad grabbed the pen Daniel handed him and scrawled the signature. Mom followed, mascara-streaked tears dripping onto the paper. Brian hesitated, but when Dad barked his name, he too signed that as they stood to leave. Brian looked back at me. His eyes were full of something I couldn't read, regret, maybe even apology. But then he turned and walked after them. When the door closed, I let out the breath I'd been holding. Judge Carter gave me a small nod. You did the right thing. Daniel Brooks clapped a hand on my shoulder. Walter would be proud, he said quietly. Standing your ground isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing when enough is enough. I touched Grandma's scarf around my neck. I never wanted their money, I whispered. I know, Daniel said. That's why they trusted you. From outside, I heard car doors slam and engines start. For the first time, I knew deep down they were gone for good. I was my grandparents' legacy now. Not their money, but their values. 6 months later, life had settled into a new rhythm. I still arrived at the school by 7:30 every morning. My counseling office remained the place where students came for advice, for listening, for steady ground. The brass nameplate on my door, Eleanor White, student counselor, meant more to me than any title written in the trust documents. That morning, a clipping from the business section sat on my desk. It announced record profits for Summit Freight under its new employee ownership model. Walter's trucks still rolled through town, but now, 68 drivers shared in the company's success. Miss White, my assistant, poked her head in. Your foundation guests are here. I walked to the conference room where 5 nervous students sat, clutching acceptance packets. They were the first scholarship recipients from the Nora and Henry White Foundation. Full tuition, living stipends, guaranteed apprenticeships. Their eyes lit up as I explained how it worked. My grandparents believed in building things that last, I told them softly. Now you're part of that legacy. Later that afternoon, I drove to the lake house. Inside, the dining table where my parents had once plotted now held a celebration. Evelyn set out glasses. Miguel arranged Grandpa's chess set. June laid Grandma's china. Remember the first meeting here? Daniel said, helping with plates. You could barely speak without shaking. Evelyn laughed. Same house, same people, different Eleanor. We toasted with sparkling cider. Marcus announced the foundation's next project, a 3D printing lab at the local community college. Walter and Nora would be so proud, Miguel said, eyes misting. That night, I sat in my room flipping through my journal. The early pages were filled with fear and grief. Later ones had recipes June had passed down, notes on Grandpa's chess moves, pressed flowers from the garden. Even the old house cat, once standoffish, now curled in my lap. Progress comes in small ways, I thought. My phone buzzed with new messages. Dad was asking for a loan to save his collapsing business. Mom was applying to join the foundation board. Brian texted about another new startup. All 3 got the same reply from me, polite, but firm refusal. On my 30th birthday, I walked into the cottage in Port Orchard. My friends and allies had surprised me with a small party. No expensive gifts, just meaningful ones. A vintage copy of my favorite book, Seeds, from June's garden. A hand-knit scarf, to choosing family by actions, not blood, Evelyn said. Raising her glass, Erin shared updates on permanent legal protections. Marcus outlined the foundation's growing impact. The following week, a sophomore sat across from me in my counseling office. They say I owe them everything, she whispered, tears in her eyes. That I wouldn't have anything if not for them. Her words echoed my past so strongly it hurt. When she finished, I handed her a packet I had prepared. Therapy options, legal resources, worksheets on setting boundaries. Your worth isn't measured by their approval, I told her gently at sunset. That evening, I walked the property. A small grove of trees had been planted, one for each scholarship recipient. A bench sat nearby, with a plaque that read, Legacy lives through love. Nora and Henry White. I opened Grandma's journal to the final blank pages and began writing my own entries. Looking back at the glowing house lights, I realized something I hadn't understood before. The inheritance that mattered most was never the money. It was the love, the lessons, and the values that my grandparents had lived by and trusted me to carry on. The months that followed moved fast, but they also felt strangely calm compared to everything I had already faced. My parents and brother had signed the agreement. They had backed off, at least on the surface, but I knew deep down that they would always try to find new angles, new ways to get back in. Still, for the first time in my life, I felt like I was ahead of them instead of always scrambling behind. Every week brought something new. Summit Freight kept growing, stronger than it had in years. The new employee ownership model gave the drivers and staff a real reason to stay loyal and motivated. For the first time, employees felt like they weren't just working for something, they were building with us. I met with Evelyn and Marcus often, going over financials and long-term plans. They treated me as an equal, not just some lucky girl who inherited money. Slowly, I started to believe that maybe I really could do this at school. I remained the same Eleanor White the students knew. The kids didn't care about my inheritance or the foundation. They just cared that I listened, that I showed up every day. And that grounded me. It reminded me of what mattered most. The foundation also grew quickly. Scholarships rolled out, and one by one, more students got a chance at education without debt weighing them down. Every time I looked at those kids' faces, I felt my grandparents with me. But of course, my family couldn't stay quiet forever. It started with whispers around town, a rumor here, a comment there. Then a newspaper article about family fractures. I ignored them, focusing on building instead of tearing down. Then one night, well after dark, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Brian stood there. He looked different, tired, thinner, almost broken. His eyes avoided mine at first. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. I let him in, but I stayed cautious. "I didn't know Dad was taking loans in my name," he said, his voice low. "I thought the startups were my idea, my failure. But now, I know he used me too." I didn't answer right away. "I don't want money," he added quickly. I don't know who I am without him telling me what to do." There was a long pause before I finally spoke. "Brian, I can't fix that for you. You'll have to figure it out yourself. But you're not a kid anymore. You choose the kind of man you want to be." For the first time, he didn't argue. He just nodded, quietly, and left. A few weeks later, I got another message. This time, from Mom. She wanted to meet for coffee, said she wanted to clear the air. I didn't respond. Some doors had to stay closed. Dad never reached out directly, but I heard through others that his business had completely collapsed. Investors had walked away. The country club revoked his membership. The man who once strutted into every room like he owned it now avoided the spotlight altogether. It didn't make me happy. It didn't make me sad either. It just was. One crisp autumn afternoon, the foundation held its first big community event. We announced the launch of a new vocational training center, funded entirely by the money my grandparents had left behind. I stood at the podium, Grandma's scarf around my shoulders, looking out at students, teachers, neighbors, and Summit Freight employees. "This isn't about money," I said, my voice steady. "It's about opportunity." My grandparents believed that the true measure of success isn't what you keep for yourself, but what you give to others. And today, we're continuing that legacy. The applause was warm, real, nothing like the hollow claps my parents once chased at social events. Afterward, as people mingled, Miguel handed me a small package. "Found this in the attic," he said with a smile. Inside was a stack of old photographs. Grandpa at his first truck. Grandma baking bread with flour on her cheek. Pictures of me as a little girl, sitting on their porch swing, laughing with them both. I held those photos like they were treasure, because they were time moved forward. 6 months turned into a year. A year turned into 2. Every season brought changes. The scholarship program doubled. The foundation built a small community library. Summit Freight expanded into 2 new states. still guided by Grandpa's simple philosophy. Treat people well, and they'll give you their best in return. At school, I counseled students who reminded me so much of myself at their age, scared, overlooked, unsure of where they fit in the world. I told them what I had learned, that your worth isn't measured by what others demand from you, but by the choices you make for yourself. The cottage in Port Orchard became my retreat. Every tree we planted for scholarship students grew taller, stronger. On quiet evenings, I sat on the bench beneath the plaque that read, "Legacy lives through love," and I wrote in Grandma's journal. The blank pages were filling quickly, not with her words, but with mine. Sometimes I wondered if my grandparents could see me, if they were proud, if they believed I was truly carrying on what they started. One night, as I walked the garden path under the stars, I realized something. The answer didn't matter. What mattered was that I believed it. On my 31st birthday, the people who had stood by me, Daniel, Marcus, Evelyn, June, Miguel, and others, gathered at the lake house again. We didn't talk about the millions of dollars. We talked about the students, the employees, the projects still to come. We laughed, we shared food, we celebrated. Evelyn raised her glass and said, "Your grandparents built this legacy, Eleanor, but you made sure it survived. And more than that, you made sure it grew." I looked around the table, feeling warmth in my chest. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. Later that night, when everyone had left, I sat by the fireplace with Grandma's scarf wrapped tight around me. I pulled out my journal, turned to a fresh page, and began to write. I never wanted their money. I only wanted to be loved, and I was. That was the true inheritance. The rest, the houses, the company, the foundation, that's just the vehicle. The real gift was knowing that love builds something that lasts, and that legacy isn't written in bank accounts. It's written in people. I closed the journal and stared at the flames. For the first time, I felt a deep peace settle inside me, because I finally understood I was their legacy, not the money, not the property. Me, and that was enough.